Grade 11s, so today we are going to go over the set of notes on the brain. Just a warning, these notes are not as in-depth as you could possibly get to understanding each of the parts of the brain. Everything is much more complicated than this. It's really interesting, so I recommend if you're interested in how the brain works and how the different parts work, take a look through. There's lots of good resources on the internet to help you learn more about it, or courses in university or college. But yeah, so this is just a very brief overview and very simplified version of what actually happens in your brain. So you should have looked through these notes here, talking about the brain and the different lobes. We have the parietal lobe, occipital, temporal, and frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is in charge of decision making, problem solving, and movement. It's the very front lobe of your brain, so frontal lobe. Temporal lobe, the temple is on the side of your head, right beside your eyes. It's kind of that, or I guess not right beside your eyes, but close to your eyes. There's kind of a soft spot on your head. Those are your temples, so it's easy to remember where the temporal lobe is. It's in charge of memory, emotion, hearing, and language. Also, temporal is close to the ears and is in charge of hearing, so we can think of it that way as well. Parietal is kind of the main big chunk of the top of your head. It's in charge of receiving and processing sensory information. So anytime you taste something, thoughts go through up into your parietal lobe, and that's where that gets processed. The occipital lobe is in charge of vision and sight. So the left side of your occipital lobe actually is in charge of your right eye, and your right side controls the left side, or your left eye. So that's kind of neat. Some people, if you've ever been hit really hard in the back of the head, if you've ever had a concussion, you fell and you hit the back of your head, you might have been seeing stars, or you might have not been able to see for a minute. That's because your occipital lobe took the brunt of that force, and that's in charge of vision. So just an interesting fact. So you did this left or right brain. This isn't necessarily a specific science. The left and right brains are in charge of different areas, but saying that you're either completely left brain or completely right brain dominant is not necessarily a fact. Just an interesting activity to try and see, and maybe learn a little bit about helpful study hints in the future for you guys. So today we are going to look more in depth at the parts of the brain. So your brain is broken up into many different parts. Each part is in control of something different. There's many more parts that we aren't going to cover in each section. Each of these things has other parts located within it. I just want you to know these general ideas, and you're going to be filling in this diagram to go along with it. So let's take a look. Start with the cerebral cortex. So this whole part, this kind of light blue with the lines in it, is your entire cerebral cortex. The label here is just pointing to the back, but it's actually this entire part. And it covers the entire left and right hemispheres. It's in charge of sensation, voluntary movement, and all conscious thought. It has all these little creases and folds in it so that your brain has a higher surface area. The higher the surface area, the more neurons that your brain has, so you actually want to have a more wrinkly and folded brain. That means you have more neurons, which leads to higher thought processing. So this blue part is the cerebral cortex, in charge of sensation, voluntary movement, and all conscious thought. We then have the cerebellum, which is this little green part down here. It's at the base of the head, separated from the brainstem. It's in charge of coordinating muscle movements and maintains posture and aids in balance. So when you're moving, it's your cerebellum that's actually allowing you to think, or I guess you don't think it, but for your left leg to take a step and then your right leg to take a step. It's in charge of those coordinated muscle movements, and then allows you to stand without falling over. So we then have the brainstem, which is made up of 3 parts. So this is your brainstem here, this light purple, this aquamarine blue here, and then this a little bit darker blue. This is your spinal cord, which we'll talk about at the very end of this. So it's just these 3 parts here. Okay, so we'll start at the bottom with the medulla, or sometimes called the medulla oblongata. That is the very bottom of your brain stem, and it's in charge of functions of the heart and the lungs. So it works to make sure that your lungs are constantly working, your diaphragm is always pulling or pulling your chest cavity more open, and then making sure that your heart's constantly beating. The pons, which means bridge in Latin, which might help you to remember that the pons is the middle part, which connects the midbrain and the medulla. So we have the pons right here. It's kind of this aquamarine blue. And it's in charge of connecting the medulla and the midbrain. So obviously it allows for communication between the two of those, but it also helps to regulate breathing. So it works very closely with the medulla specifically to regulate breathing. So if you have damage to your pons, you have a very hard time having coordinated lung function. So while the medulla works for the heart and the lungs, the pons is very specific to helping the medulla with regulated breathing. Okay, so then we have the midbrain, which is above the pons, and it's in purple here. And it's in charge of relaying information between the cerebrum, which we'll talk about later, and the spinal cord. It also helps with visual, auditory, and tactile responses. So these two are in charge of kind of basic life functions, the pons specifically for breathing, and this midbrain is in charge of visual, auditory, and tactile responses. Okay, so this is also part of your kind of relay station to get information up into the rest of the brain. So we'll look at the thalamus next, which is this little yellow-shaped object here. The thalamus is in charge of receiving all sensory information and sends it to the cerebellum. So our sensory information comes all the way up through here. The midbrain passes it on to the thalamus as well as the cerebellum, which we again are going to talk about just in a minute. So that, again, the thalamus receives sensory information and then sends it where it needs to go to the cerebellum. The hypothalamus, so hypo means below, so we can see that our hypothalamus would be below right here, helps to maintain homeostasis. So it creates hormones and controls the pituitary gland, and it's the link between our nervous system and our endocrine system. And we'll talk a little bit more about the endocrine system, but that is just what releases hormones throughout your body. So this pituitary gland is right down here, and again, we'll talk about that in a minute, but the hypothalamus helps to control the pituitary gland, which is in charge of releasing tons of hormones into your body. So this hypothalamus really works to maintain homeostasis. The whole point of releasing hormones is to bring our body back to a normal kind of situation. So yeah, hypothalamus located below the thalamus and is in charge of helping maintain homeostasis. That's the big takeaway from this. So next we'll look at the corpus callosum, which is this little pinky purple area in the middle here. And it's in charge of connecting the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. So if we go all the way back up to this, again, really funny diagram here, this is the corpus callosum, the great mediator. We have our two sides of our brain, right? And so this is what allows those two to connect, and there's information shared through the corpus callosum between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. It says we need to work together. Really funny. Great humor. So anyways, that's the corpus callosum. It connects those two and allows them to communicate. Moving on to the pituitary gland. So it's in red here, this very tiny little thing. It's an endocrine gland that releases specific hormones. And then, like I said, we're not going to really talk about that in detail right now. We'll talk about that later when we are talking more specifically about the endocrine system. But for now, just know that it's an endocrine gland that releases hormones. So now we're going to talk about the hippocampus and the amygdala. So the hippocampus is located right here. It's this tan colored object. And so the hippocampus is in charge of learning and memories, and it works with the amygdala. So your hippocampus is in charge of memories. The amygdala is not shown on this diagram, but it's really important to helping form memory. So it works with the hippocampus to connect emotion to memory. So our amygdala, which again is not shown on here, it's about right here, just attached to the hippocampus, but it's not shown. So the hippocampus and the amygdala, hippocampus forms the memory, and the amygdala connects usually an upsetting emotion such as fear and anger to a memory to help you remember in such like a fight or flight situation that's a dangerous situation, we have to get away from that. It can help connect happy emotions as well, but it plays a bigger role in connecting an emotion such as fear or anger to a memory. Okay, so the last thing we're going to look at is the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is in dark blue right at the base here. It allows for communication between the brain and the nerves of the body. So your brain is connected completely to your body, obviously, and it's via this spinal cord. So we're going to look a little bit more at the spinal cord when we move on to the central nervous system next class. But for now, just know that it connects between the brain and the nerves of the body. And so that's kind of it for understanding the different parts of the brain and the different lobes of the brain. If you have any questions, let me know. Fill in your notes, and that's all.